Hey everybody, I hope you can see me. It's Monday night. Are we live? Are we live? Are we live? Yeah, yeah, we're live. Look at there. I've got so many programs going. I've got so many programs going, but it's Monday night. I'm gonna see if I can actually get this intro to work. So without further ado, it's the Disputed Lands intro you've all been waiting for. Let's go.
Well, just because you have an understanding of the Bible in your head doesn't necessarily mean that you have Jesus in your heart.
Get right, get inside, get hungry, got appetite. Everlasting water, never again thirsty. To disputed lands, take a journey.
You are listening to Chad Schaefer on Disputed Lands.
You're getting another one this week. Well, what do you know? It looks like it actually worked this time. I don't know whether to be impressed, surprised, or if I can be surprised and impressed. Can I be both? Doug, what do you think?
Sure.
Okay.
Doesn't cost any more.
So this is our fourth installment. I have to say I've really enjoyed doing this with you, Doug. Cap off this.
Me too.
We're going to cap this off by talking about one of the things that I know the topic you really wanted to get to, even at the very beginning. And maybe I kind of got the sense that this had something to do with why you got even interested in looking at this to begin with. I could be wrong. You could correct me, but this, the dating of the Exodus, as we mentioned last week with and I had his name and I just forgot it again. Tim Mahoney's work was so fascinating, and there's so many others that had done pieces of chronology surrounding this. But it seems to me this might have had something to do with getting you started in this. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think seeing the film, which I saw originally 2 years ago, maybe, and then I've watched a couple of times more on Netflix. It got me very interested in it, and I thought, wow, this, the value of getting the dating right, so it links up with the archaeology, which is empirical. It's not, theoretical. It's empirical. Getting that right has, for me at least, I think for a lot of people, real apologetic value. It helps to validate that the scripture is accurate. And I think that's important.
Well, yeah, I absolutely. We have to. In being a Berean, there's so many different topics you can look at, so many things that you can. They call them rabbit trails that you can go down in the searching out of truth, and there seems to be such a plethora of folks out there that it can be hard. It can be really hard to take any in-depth look at any one topic. So that's why I think this, one of the reasons I believe this book is so important because, it's one thing, Doug, to do your own research and you have something that's grabbed a hold of your heart and to dig into it and find out just everything you can about that. So you're not only have the truth and your conclusions, are going to be on the money, but also to answer the questions that can come at you, right? Because as a publisher, as a writer, those are the kinds of things you think of when you're writing this. It's like, is somebody going to come at me with a question or something that I want to be ready? I want to be prepared, or at least have a good understanding to acknowledge, to answer those kind of questions. Why I believe
you
what I
got to
believe.
be ready to defend Yeah, you got to be ready to defend your thesis. It's just like a kind of like a mathematical theorem or something that you have to defend academically. It's like to put this forth. I have to really be ready to defend it. That's why there's so many footnotes in the book.
Yeah, and so when the point I was trying to get to is that's why people will need to get this book, because he lays out the footnotes in the details, so you can take that deep dive from one source, right? You can go to one source and without having to find all that information on yourself. So tonight we're going to start with this. It's chapter 6 in his book. With this format that I'm using now that allowed me to do my intro and all this fancy computer stuff, Doug, I don't have the images. I didn't figure out how to get your book images over into that yet. I apologize for that.
That's okay.
People will just have to get the book and they'll just have to get the book and do it on their own. But we're going to be doing chapter 6, Establishing the Exodus, a Chronology Controversy Part 1. So you start. I love the opening of this chapter. I'm not, so I'm just going to read it here. I'll just read this, and I'm going to let you go.
Read the first paragraph.
Yeah, I'm going to, because I really loved how this started. When we think of ancient chronology, our minds fixate on Egypt and images arising from millennia past, like the Sphinx and the Gaza pyramids. The notion that Egypt's history represents humanity's antiquity isn't just a conception made famous by films and television. This predilection is validated by the world of archaeology, too. The chronology of Egypt is the benchmark for antiquity across the Mediterranean world, and from Carthage in North Africa to Babylon in West Asia. But however ancient other civilizations are, Egypt seems still older to popular thinking. I mean, I could read on there, but the way this chapter opened, I really loved it. I was like, yeah, that's it, because I spent a lot of time studying Egypt myself, so that's my thing. I was like, oh, you tell him, Doug, you tell him.
Right. Well, obviously it's a truism, that there's really, when we think of ancient civilization, there really are two: Mesopotamia, Sumeria, and so forth, and Egypt. And the reality, by the way, your picture just went off. Is your voice still there?
Yeah, no, I'm here. You're
good. Okay.
It's just the new formatting. I have to click back and forth when the other's speaking, and I got to remember to do it.
Oh, no worries. Well, it saves bandwidth too. So anyway, so there are two really ancient civilizations that we think of, Mesopotamia and Egypt. Technically, Mesopotamia is probably hundreds of years older, and in reality, if we think in terms of the Garden of Eden and all that, there's really two locations that are contemplated for the Garden of Eden. One is in sort of central to north central Africa, which Standeo has done a lot of work on. The other is, of course, in Mesopotamia. I still haven't really gotten fully on board with Stan's point of view. For right now, things still seem like it makes more sense to be in Mesopotamia.
You're talking about Standeo's view on the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, Stan tends to believe that it's in sort of Central Africa.
Yeah,
yeah,
I've got problems with that one too. But I don't believe in the Pangea thing. I don't believe in that. I mean, I know it looks good, but anyway, that's another topic.
those are definitely another topic. So, main point is that Mesopotamia is actually older, but there's not as many cool things to see as there are when we look at the images of Egypt. And then the other issue that kind of is in the back of the mind of those of us that are a little bit open to studying some of the alternate history is the question mark about whether the Sphinx and the Giza pyramids really are just the age that academia says they are, which is around 2500 BC, or in fact the evidence seems going to be covered a lot in part 2. I'm studying that very intensely now, but that's really part 2. But this issue on Egypt is really to try to tie two things together. We have in Genesis 5 and 11, we have the chronologies from really from Adam to Noah, and then from Noah down to Isaac. And but from Isaac to to Saul and moving into the kings, you have these other periods that are more debatable. In other words, the chronology from Isaac to Adam is laid out very specifically, very particularly in years, um, and then the kingdom of Israel. There's still some controversy there of around 40 years or so, but essentially from Saul to the destruction of the first temple in 586 BC. We kind of know those dates, but there's about 1,000-year gap in between where there's a lot of debate. Of course, right dab in the middle of all that is the Exodus. And so the main thesis I've got, which I think is demonstrable, is that if you can really pin down the date of the Exodus, then you can tie all of the chronology together. So you can establish the linkage between the kingdoms of Israel with Saul and David and Solomon, and you can link all the way back then to Abraham and his entry into Canaan, and then Isaac and Jacob's entry ultimately Jacob's entry into Egypt.
Yeah, what seems to be critical in this, and we mentioned this, I think, briefly in the last episode, is the timing of the Exodus, and that is all based upon, again, the easiest, simplest way is to work from your known point of origin and work your way backwards in time. And a lot of people will then start with the prophecies that are given in Daniel, right, as the arriving of the Messiah, because it's perfectly calculated 69 and the 70 in that book.
Yeah.
So if you know those years, Yeshua's, the zero mark, plus minus one plus one, right?
Yeah.
If you can start with that and then count backwards, and then you go from that time, the second temple time, and take that backwards, then you can get a better idea. And there's always been a controversy, it seems like, on the greater range of 400 years. I've seen 400 years at the greater range to less. It seems like there's always been right in that time frame, but nobody's been able to say, well, I definitively can say it's this, because of these chronology issues that you're discussing. The Usher chronologies have always had a problem with lining up, because they're always at the other end of the spectrum of that 400 years. One's way up here.
Well, yeah. Let me try to explain it.
Yeah,
this way.
Go ahead. You wrote the book. You do it.
I'll try to. Let's accept for a moment that the academics are right about when the Giza pyramids were built. Let's assume that they were built about 2500 BC, and let's assume that the Sphinx was built about the same time. I think the evidence is very strong that it was built long before, but let's assume that that's true. If we go with Usher's dating, if we go with the King James Bible's dating, it suggests that the flood was about 150 years after the academics say that the Giza pyramids and the Sphinx were built. So the Usher dating is about 2350 BC for the flood. And then if you speculate about how long it was from there to the Tower of Babel, that's going to be about another 150 to 200 years. And so that puts you around 2150 to 2200, let's say, BC. Now what we're saying is the Tower of Babel was built about 350 years after the pyramids were built. All right, so now what that says is that if you're going to, unless you're going to say, well, the pyramids really weren't built in 2500 BC, they really were built more like in 1800 BC or 1900 BC. And when you say that, guess what? Now you're saying that Abraham lived before the pyramids were built, and everything falls apart. And that's why if you look at the chronology of the Usher version, what really trips you up is the date of the flood and the date of Babel, the Tower of Babel. Now, if you go with the Septuagint chronology, you add 1,000 years to when the flood occurred. All of a sudden, the flood now occurs around 3350 BC rather than 2350 BC. And the Tower of Babel occurs around 3150 BC rather than 2150 BC. And so now you've got a pretty good amount of time between the Tower of Babel incident or event and when the Egyptian first dynasty begins. And presumably it's, the academics say it's about the fourth or fifth dynasty. They say around 2600 BC, when the Giza pyramids, they began to build the Giza pyramids. They were finished sometime by, in that time frame. All right. So what I, of course, do is I go further. I talk about why it is that the Egyptian chronology is wrong based upon the work of Tim Mahoney and David Roll and some others. But essentially what it does is it allows for us to build a chronology based upon the Septuagint's timing that fits with Egyptology and fits with Mesopotamian archaeology. Right? So that's the critical thing. The Usher, let's say 200, 300 years ago, the Usher chronology was fine because we had no idea how old the pyramids were. We had no idea that we discover all these cuneiform tablets in Mesopotamia. We'd be able to begin to identify certain dates and times. But now we know these things. Now we have all this empirical evidence. And all this empirical evidence dramatically contradicts the King James Bible and the Usher chronology. For me, that's very unsatisfying. And so I'm saying, well, how do you answer that? Well, and of course, the answer is you really got to go back and ask what was the authentic chronology. And it's not in the Masoretic text. It's in the Septuagint. I'll pause.
No, that's okay. I appreciate, when I read this, I appreciate it so much because this is why you got to study a wide range of people. And this is why you've got to consider all the information that's being put in front of you. Because I've read a lot of information about chronologies. We have a mutual friend, Doug Krieger, and if you're in Doug Krieger's circle, you can't avoid it. I mean, he sends you chronologies. He sends you dates. He sends you times. Oh, yeah. That's his thing. And so I'm reading these things all the time. And it's not to knock Doug, but these are the kind of things that most people who talk about these things, with the information you're provided, it does make sense. But when you add in this additional information that you just presented about the dates and what it does to like Abraham, and when he had to have been alive, if that's accurate according to the dates archaeology is presenting, it throws a wrench in it, and so you never hear you never hear those things, and so that's why it
throws about 1,000-year wrench into it. It's not minor. It's huge.
Yeah,
that's why the King James Version can look very foolish.
Right. Yeah, and so I just want people to appreciate that aspect because, if you take that in, and you mentioned the Sphinx too, I believe it's much older as well because it had antediluvials upon it, and they did actually a study on that Sphinx with weathering and everything. And their study, the scientific study, proved that the weathering that is shown on it could not have happened in the time frame they say it was built. It had to be, and as you said, not just a little older, much older, to have had the wear on it that is showing in the antediluvials that are Pleistocene.
Correct.
Pleistocene alluvials that are found upon its top. And you say, well, that's a fancy name. What's a Pleistocene alluvial? It's just another way of saying deposits from being underwater.
Yeah, there's that, and the real kicker, which a professor from Boston University, a guy named Robert Schoch, who I'm sure you're familiar with, he's the one that did this intense analysis. He's a geologist, and he did this intense analysis of the surroundings where the Sphinx is. The Sphinx was actually probably originally just the head, and then it was carved. All the body was carved out beneath it, and all of the blocks that were pulled out around the Sphinx were moved across further east, and they created what was known as the Sphinx Temple. Right, and this was done a long time ago because the weathering around the edges of this area where the Sphinx is indicates that it had to rain, and it couldn't have rained just for a few years. It had to rain for 1,000 or 2,000 years,
right,
for it to weather the way that it did. So
yeah, I'm sure the guy you're talking about is the guy I remember either listening or reading.
Yeah, Robert Schoch. He's the expert in this, and he's the one that's done the work. I'm quite familiar with all of the Egyptian scholars and all of the alternate scholars, and then I read pretty extensively on it because in part 2 I'm going to pose the question, and I'm not taking a position right now, but I'm posing the question. Let's assume the Septuagint's chronology is correct at 5616, which is what I propose. The church fathers all propose around the same time frame, plus or minus 100 to 200 years. So they're all go back a lot further than the King James. But what the empirical evidence around the Sphinx and other circumstantial evidence around the pyramids proposes that that whole complex may have been built several thousand years before the chronology picks up in the Bible. And what that tends to lead us to then is the question of, okay, let's assume that we have Adam and Eve, that they really are direct creations of God. Let's assume that there was a 6-day creation, but was it a creation or was it a recreation? And was there a gap? And this, of course, gets into the gap theory. Mm-hmm. But it suggests that it could be that the world is considerably older, not necessarily 4.5 billion years older, but let's assume for a second maybe it's 1 million years old. And there's this new thing called the electric universe, which is proposing all kinds of alternate ways of understanding the age of the universe, which I don't get into at all in this part of the book. I'll get into it some in part 2.
Well,
but I really some interesting questions about that.
Yeah, I really hope you do, because that's something I've been looking into as well. The electric universe. There's actually even a YouTube channel that's called the Thunderbird Project, or
the Thunderbolts Project.
Thunderbolts Project, and I recommend people go view it because a lot of the information there really is science, not scientism. And for me, who has researched quite a bit into flat Earth, Doug, is that
been forced to.
Yeah. Well, one of the problems with the model is put forth by our scientists today is they cannot tell you or define for you, according to the model that they are using, what gravity is based on their models.
Correct.
The electric universe can explain gravity because it's attraction and pull and right. So I mean it can explain it. So that's
it explains so many things that the gravity model cannot explain.
Yeah.
And I everything because I watch a lot of their videos because I'm beefing up my knowledge to get ready for part 2, and then I still have to write a volume 2 of Revising Reality. Revising Reality is going to get much more into the science of the electric universe and the gap theory and some of those kinds of things.
Now is Gons, Josh, and there was another
Anthony.
Guy. Anthony, are they all going to be doing that with you again?
I'm hoping that I'm not sure about Josh. I'm thinking Anthony probably will, and I'm thinking Gons probably will. But I've kind of see where they are. It's going to be at least a year away before I'm ready to tackle Revising Reality Part 2. I will mention that Revising Reality Part 1 does touch on the electric universe some, and it also touches on some of the related factors about Saturn, which they talk about, and some other things that that's a book that still sells quite a bit because it has a lot of sort of word of mouth references and things like that. So it still sells quite a bit. But it's
Well,
got
well,
a second volume will come of that, but it's about 18 months away.
well, if Josh is out and you need somebody to step in, I might know somebody.
No, I'd like to know. I actually know one fellow, but definitely I want to search around and kind of interview some people because I would like a team of 4.
I was trying to be subtle and mention myself, but if I have to interview for it, I'll interview for it.
Oh no! I
was a little too subtle.
No. I appreciate that, and that's absolutely something we'll talk about. We need to look at the piece parts that need to go into that book, and I don't have them all figured out yet. I know quite a bit of it's going to be on the solar system, and quite a bit's going to be electric universe, and some of it's going to be in gap theory. I'm only going to barely introduce that in part 2 of rebooting the Bible. Because all I want to do is I want to pose that some of these questions, when we go beyond the chronology of the Septuagint, all I can really do is kind of open the door. And I'm hoping that other young folks like yourself and other people will look at that and say, gee, there's a lot of work to be done here. And by the way, the guys in the electric universe, these guys got to be Christian too. I mean, they don't talk about it, but because of the things they're saying, they believe in a younger Earth, not necessarily 4.5 billion years and not 6,000 years. They believe in something in between. And that tells me that they're probably Christians.
Well, the thing about it is that anybody who really takes an honest look at these things, you cannot get away from a creator. You cannot get away from organization.
That's right.
It's too well put together. It's too big of a machine. It operates too good.
That's right. That's right. I was going to say, I watched about a 20-minute episode. When you're recovering from back surgery, you have time to watch a lot of YouTube videos.
Right.
And so I'm using the time to do a lot of research, basically.
Right.
But I watched a 20-minute episode on the movie Contact, which was written by Carl Sagan of Cosmos fame. And some of the things that are pointed out, because they go into more detail explaining the movie, but the comparison of the book to the movie, and some of the things that Sagan thought and so forth. But it ultimately concludes that the book conveys, as well as the movie, that there is intelligent design behind the cosmos.
Well, here's something else, and this goes right along with your book and kind of my book. So, I mean, and you're well aware of this, the pyramids alignment to the Orion belt, right?
Right.
In the skies. Well, and if you're familiar with David Flynn's work or Mark Flynn's work, well, then you will know that it's not only just that area, but every ancient city on the earth was built in alignment with the stars, right?
Sure.
You say, okay.
And ley lines.
And ley lines. So, well, good enough. Okay, I can.
Right.
Okay, good enough. But there's a guy by the name of, his last name I want to say is Monk. And this dude is real cool. It looks like it was filmed in the 70s on one of the old projectors, because he was even using the old things where you had the plastic sheets that you wrote on and you slid them underneath the projector, it had a magnifier that the light shined up through the overhead projector that shined the light through and projected on the wall.
Still exist.
They
still exist in college classrooms.
Well, he was using one of these, but it looks like it's from the 70s.
Yeah.
But if I can find that, I'll send it to you. But he was showing how mathematically, using pi, phi, and everything else, these ancient monument locations were exact numeric exponential distances from each other.
Oh, yeah, and they align, too.
They're actual, if you multiply pi times 7, it's that distance from this one to that one. Now, think about what that means. That also, because these things are aligned to the stars, it means also that the stars are aligned exponentially in a perfect synchronous mathematical thing. You can't see it by looking up. I get excited about this. They're mathematically aligned. They're perfectly aligned.
The Earth It puts the Earth at the center of the
and
cosmos.
it's at the center. And again,
Right.
it's something you can't get
For
away with.
For your viewers, check out a thing called The Principle.
Yeah,
movie
they've
called The
seen it.
Principle.
They've seen it.
Oh, have they? Okay.
Oh yeah. If they're
and
watching this
Galileo
show,
was
they've
wrong
seen it.
and all that. Yeah, I don't buy the flat Earth, but I do buy the.
Well,
Principle.
maybe one of these days I'll convert you, because the science keeps. And I go fighting, kicking, and scream too. But the more you look at the science, it's just like, come on, guys, this model doesn't work that you've been pushing on us for 100 years. It's just not working. It doesn't work. And anyway.
Well, I hear you.
But anyway,
that is another subject for another time.
that is another subject for another time. I'm sorry.
On a good day. You'll have to catch me on a good day to even talk about it, because
Well,
it frustrates me to win.
you know, you'll either get to it or you won't, Doug. I'm not going to try to convert you.
Right.
I will spend some time with you on Commonwealth theology, but that's not.
That's okay. I'm not that far away from Commonwealth theology.
I
the
know
main thing about the flat Earth is, if I adopt the flat Earth, nobody's going to listen to me about anything else I say.
Well, I understand. That's
yeah, and that's
understand.
not the only reason. It's one of the reasons why I really don't even want to delve into it.
You know, we don't. I'm not either. I mean, people who've watched Disputed Lands, Now You See TV, they do spend a lot of time on this project. I have good friends. One of my best friends has a show called Flat Out Insights, and that
little pun in there.
Yeah. And so he does that. They spend time. I point people to those folks. I've never done over a year. I've never done a Flat Earth show. But anyway,
right.
So anyway, so there are other people.
Let's get back to
yeah.
Egypt.
I'm sorry. I'm rabbit trailing tonight. I can't help it.
Right.
It's just the way I am tonight.
Well, anyway, yeah. I mean, the main point that we were on was that there could be things beyond the chronology of the Septuagint. I'm going to take those things up in part 2. Right now, in part 1, what we're trying to do is we're just trying to tie together the chronologies of Genesis 5 and 11 all the way back to Jesus. Really, and that's what we're really trying to do in chapters 6 and 7 of the book, is show the linkages and to work through some of the real thorny problems with the chronology of the Exodus, the conquest of the of Canaan, and the time of the Judges. These are probably the thorniest areas of chronology in the Bible. It's slightly more than 1,000 years in which there are many theories, and there's a lot of debate and a lot of controversy. So that's really what I'm working on in those, because my real goal is to give the reader a chronology really from the time of Jesus all the way back to Adam, and to be within just 2 or 3 decades across that whole time span.
Yeah. Now, when you're talking about Egypt in here, you're talking in this dating, which is we're talking. You said in Egyptian chronology, in your book you state that there's 3 primary periods: Old, Middle, and New.
Right.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, a little bit. Okay. The Old Kingdom really is what we think of as sort of the 1st through the 4th, 5th dynasty. And so when we think of the pyramids and we think of the Sphinx and all that from an academic position, that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about the old kingdoms. Now, there are newer temples, like the temple at Karnak, things like that. Some of the newer things that are into the new kingdom. But if I recall, even the new kingdom is done really before, I'd say, if I had my chart, I could look at it, but it's around 1200 BC or whatever. And so you're really done between the, old, middle, and new, really before, let's say, 1000 BC. You kind of go into this dark period where Egypt is not really a superpower after sort of Ramesses II. And there's a couple of key battles in that time frame around 1100, 1200 BC. You get into this whole issue about Shishak and Shishonk and all that. And there's what's an ironic thing, and it's much too complicated to cover in a radio show. But ironically, Egyptian, and I'll just have to throw this out, and I can't really explain it very well because it's really complicated. But Egyptian chronology is based upon the Bible. And unfortunately, it's based upon two significant misunderstandings about the Bible that are not correct. And so what happens is Egyptian chronology gets thrown off by at least 200 years, meaning that the chronology is in some respects older and in some respects younger. And so it is a mess. And it's because they misunderstand certain facets of what is taught in the scripture, and they make parallels between Shishak of, I think it's First Kings, and Shishonk of Egypt, believing that these two are the same, and they're not. They're about 200 years apart. And so this goes back to the original guy, Champollion, and the Rosetta Stone, and so forth. And so we're now dealing with some original work in the Egyptology area back in the 19th century, when the Egyptologists were so eager to prove the Bible that they made some correlations between certain names, certain hieroglyphics, that they were really at that time just learning how to read, because it was Champollion that discovered the Rosetta Stone, that allowed, because the Rosetta Stone was set up with the hieroglyphics, Demotic, Egyptian Demotic, which is a cursive Egypt writing, and then Greek, they were able to then begin to understand how to read the hieroglyphics. But they got some things wrong. And so it led to some confusion. So there's a lot of chronology that is not accurate.
Well, and you point out
it plays havoc with the Exodus.
Well, and you point out in your book too, and this is again something that I didn't know, but you can go buy Doug's book and read it for yourself, is that the dynasties we don't even have, other than the hieroglyphs, which we can now translate thanks to the Rosetta Stone. We can translate the different dynasties that ruled there. But as far as the order in their dynasties, we don't have the direct record. All we have are tertiary, what is known as tertiary, or second-hand notes of that.
Yes, a lot of it comes from the history. That's right. There's some of it that comes from the history on that was carved in the sides of like Karnak, but a lot of it comes from a writer named Manetho,
right,
who wrote about the different dynasties and gave us kind of a first cut at Egyptian history, and a lot of things, of course, he got wrong, and not everything, but he got quite a bit. And so a lot of the problem, you're exactly right, is that Egyptian academic chronology, in many respects, is chock full of errors, and so part of the trouble in trying to reconstruct the biblical chronology is you have to take a grain of salt, take Egyptian chronology with a grain of salt, and try to dig into it deeper. And that's kind of what I did with. Obviously, I wouldn't have been able to do it without David Rohl and Tim Mahoney in that movie. But even still, when you look at that, then study it with some other references and things, then you can begin to pull together in fact, Barry Setterfield, I haven't mentioned Barry Setterfield. He's really key to the whole study that I did. And he and I don't agree on everything, but he's the guy that really got me started down his path. And he's a very smart mathematician, earth scientist, and he's a young earther, actually. And so he has some fascinating ideas about why the universe appears to be the age that it is and all that. But anyway, his work on this was instrumental in me analyzing all these things as well. So those are kind of some of the key sources that I leveraged. And you can find his work, by the way, Barry Setterfield, Setterfield, Barry Setterfield. He's an Aussie, and he is fabulous.
Yeah.
And not again anybody, you can't agree with everything, but he sure has some great stuff.
Let's see. You also talk about. You may have just mentioned it, and you skipped through it, and I didn't read it. I'm just looking through my notes here.
Yeah.
You talk about the false accusation of Pharaoh Ramesses II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, that Ramesses, in terms of the time frame, He was sort of in the 1200 BC time frame, and also known as Sistronk. And so, a fascinating character. He was the one that Cecil B. DeMille decided was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and but he actually lived probably 350 to 400 years after the Exodus, based upon my research. But he is Ramesses is the very famous guy. The key to it was probably an interpolation in the first chapter of Exodus.
Yeah.
That talks about the city of Ramesses, which probably someone wrote in that later to try to provide the context or kind of the local knowledge on what was going on and where this was. But Ramesses, actually, the Ramessid family was a couple hundred to 300 years, I think almost 400 years after the Exodus.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the challenge, again, of Egyptian chronology. There's a lot of mistakes in it.
Yeah, and you even put the quote in here. The Septuagint reads, "And he set over them taskmasters who should afflict them in their works. And they built strong cities for Pharaoh, both Pithom and Ramesses, and on which is Heliopolis."
Right.
The King James Version was a shorter version with a material difference. Therefore, they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramesses. So there's a slight difference, but it's a major one. Now,
well, yeah, the key thing is the Septuagint adds the city of On, which was, I think it says that's Heliopolis.
Right. Well, yeah, and
yeah.
On, which
that's
is Heliopolis. Now, yeah.
That tells me it was probably the Egyptians that were doing the translation that said, oh, gee, let's just go ahead and add that other city in there because we know what that city was, and that was an important city. The problem was that earlier you see the word both, and what the Septuagint shows is 3 cities, not 2. So
which, again,
we know there was a little interpolation going on there.
Which again, to me, it just it keeps proving to me your point, and I'm not even going to say begrudgingly, but it just keeps us saying, okay, he's made another point. The Septuagint being a more accurate version of the scriptures, it keeps validating itself in this regard when you start showing and pointing out these kinds of things in the translations.
Oh yeah, the other big one that I talk about, which gets into the dating, is in First Kings, where it talks about the number of years from the Exodus until the temple, the ground was broken more or less for Solomon's temple. It says that it was 480 years. Well, the Septuagint says it's 440 years. Well, which is it? Well, actually, the Septuagint's shorter time frame is correct. And that would seem to make it less time. But the problem is that there's a whole bunch of time in the Judges chronology that's not typically identified when chronologists look into it. And it gets into this thing called the omission principle. And we can talk a little bit about the Judges period, because that is in some ways, that's the thorniest of all of these chronology problems.
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, we can go right into that, but I just want to make sure that people are clear about what we just said. So this translation error is most likely, and Doug is presenting a very good case here. The reason people are confusing Ramses with the Pharaoh is because they're not naming him as the Pharaoh of the time. They're naming cities, and because it became associated with that city at a later date, when they're doing the translation, that's what it was used. And so it's not the time of Ramses, but that's the city that it was called then. Yeah,
it's kind of like Leningrad and St. Petersburg.
Sure.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
And so they decided, well, let's update the name to the current name.
Exactly. When they're doing the translation, so because it would make sense.
The old name was Avaris.
Which is logical, because it would make more sense to the reader of that day who would read it.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's that city as it used to be known is no longer known as that city. So
And the Masoretic text takes it out. It takes out the reference to Heliopolis because why? Because the Jews don't care about Egyptian, geography.
exactly. I mean, this anyway. You just,
Yeah,
uh, dude, you're
yeah.
good. You're
The
making a
point
good
is
case.
that as you go through
You're
the
making.
Septuagint, and it's a lifelong task. Let me tell you, you will find differences again and again and again and again, and some of them are really, really significant. And the one I discovered that Barry Setterfield didn't mention, in terms of the 440 years instead of the 480 years, factors into the chronology in a surprising way. So, and
Well,
that's something that nobody's really talked about. So,
well. Did you talk about it, or is there more information on
I
that?
did. No,
Okay.
it's in there. No,
Okay.
I have to, because I have to factor that into to get from you have to go from when did Israel and Judah split? Let's just kind of walk through this at a
Go
very high.
ahead.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So we know 586 BC. We know that was the sort of end of Judah, but we know about 707 BC was the end of Israel. But if you
I
go back
agree.
to right, so we sort of say, okay, well, when did the kingdom split between Israel and Judah? All right, the academics say it split about 930 BC, 930
Right.
BC. The correct timing of its split was about 971 BC. And this gets into a fairly technical discussion comparing comparing Assyrian chronology based upon what's called the Black Obelisk with the biblical chronology. And even evangelical scholars for the last 50 years have bought into the fact that they believe the Assyrian chronology is more accurate than the Bible's chronology. Well, it messes it up. All right. So there's about 41 years that if you go back and you go with what the Bible teaches, it's going to tell you that the kingdom split up around 971. So then you work back to Solomon, David, and Saul, and so forth. And when was the temple actually finished? Solomon's temple was finished in 1005 BC. He started the temple in 1012 BC. His reign began in 1016 BC. So then you jump back 40 years to David, which takes you to 1056 BC. And 40 years before that takes you to Saul, 1096 BC. All right, so now we're at 1096 BC. Now, from there, the last judge was Samuel. From Samuel's time, we have to go back to the conquest of Canaan. So we go from you can do a little math here if you have a calculator. You go from 1096 BC to my date for the conquest of Canaan, which is 1588 BC, and it was concluded about 1581 BC. All right, so from 1588 BC, 1581 BC, really, Joshua is the first judge. All right, he's judging starting in 1581 BC after the conquest of Canaan is complete. The final judge is Samuel. Samuel is the one, that basically selects Saul, and here's the people. People all want a king, and so Samuel gives them a king. All right, so you've got essentially just a little less than 500 years. All right, so you may recall that 440 years. This gets a little thorny, but the long and short of it is that there are all of the judges, the chronology in the Bible. There are dates given for everyone's length of term
Right.
as judges, except Joshua and Samuel. They are variable. It's not clear. So you have to kind of deduce those based upon now jumping to what was the probable date of the Exodus. But anyway, we know that the period of the judges was a little less than 500 years. Now, the conquest of Canaan and the Exodus gets tied to a variety of things. But it also, you have to look at when was Abraham born, when was Isaac born, when did Jacob come into Canaan, and so forth. And again, this is all laid out very meticulously in the book. And all I can do here is give you a very high level overview. But yeah, go ahead.
No, yeah, no, that I completely understand. If you see me looking down over here, Doug, they don't see me, but I had to turn off some of my stuff. My feed apparently was buffering, and people were only getting about 95% of the show, so that's why I'm having to look down now to make sure everything's going smoothly here.
Right.
There was a question. Here, and we've got about.
We can run a few minutes long if you want to.
Oh, okay, good. Well, maybe I'll back this up. I'll come out to this question at the end. Then so go ahead. Then keep going. If you're able to go a little longer, then I won't interrupt you now. Yeah. Go ahead. Keep going.
Let me just kind of give people sort of a big blocks here. Abraham was born, based upon the information that I researched, in 2128 BC. 100 years later, Isaac was born. We know that Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And we know that the promise made to Abraham was when he was 70. And so we have 30 years from that to Isaac. Then there's a debate. Again, we can't do it here, but the Bible goes into two alternatives in terms of how long the Israelites were in slavery in Egypt. And Cecil B. DeMille says it was 400 years. Doug Woodward says it was 100 years. and there's a lot of scholars that say that's correct, because there's a split from the time that Jacob, or Israel, enters into the land. Joseph has already been there for a number of years. Joseph's about 40 years old, and Jacob's about 121, I believe, when he comes into Egypt. And what will happen is that from the time of Abraham entering into Canaan until the time of, I'm trying to make sure I get this exactly right, until the time of coming into Egypt, Joseph and so forth, it's 215 years. And then from the time of the next 215 years goes from that moment until the Exodus. And so there's a period of 430 years. The Masoretic text says that all of this time was in Egypt. The Septuagint says that half of the time was in Canaan and half of the time was in Egypt. But not all of the time in Egypt were the Israelite slaves. And so when you work through the data, it works out that Israelites were slaves in Egypt for about 100 years. Right? And there's a good video by Nathan Hoffman that talks about this and explains this in good detail out on YouTube. So look out for Nathan H. And it was, I think, how long was Israel captive in Egypt?
And that's a really important topic, because, I mean, if you read it in the scriptures, and this is easy to do, just like any of these chronologies, we read it from one sentence to another sentence, and you can have just transversed 70 years.
Yeah.
And just because you can read it from sentence to sentence, right, or from you don't really get a sense, the full sense or the weight of what's taking place there that alludes.
That's right.
And when you read that, so, in Pharaohs, we started doing all this stuff. Pharaoh started doing all this stuff to them. It kind of puts you in this. This was over a long period of time that these additional weight kept getting put on Israel as they were there, and so that it got to be more burden than they could bear, right? And that's
right, more burden.
Everything, which brings another question. I'll just ask it in here. What length of time do you see the 10 plagues happening over? Do you see them happening over what period of time?
Oh, I haven't really studied it. My thinking would be weeks, maybe months, but not years.
Right.
You might know the answer to this, though.
I'm with you. I think that it was over a period of about probably about a year is what I
Could be, yeah.
my thoughts that
Mhm.
that it actually divided into 10, so that it would have started with the feast and ended with the, of
Yeah.
course, with the Passover.
Moses' age and how long, we know Moses' age. He died at 120, split up into three 40-year periods. And there was between the second and third, when he was 80, is when he really went back to Egypt and said, let my people go.
Mm-hmm.
And supposedly that, he was at 40, and then he died after 40 years in the wilderness when they were ready to go into Canaan to do the conquest of Canaan, and he was 120. So we know that
It says in
that
about
period
the
can't
scripture
be
always
that
throw in
long.
that word about 40 years.
Yeah. And
So
so we know it's probably months. It's probably not quite a year.
right,
Could be a year, but it might only be 3 months or 6 months or 9 months.
or
So it's in
10.
that. Yeah, it's in that time. Yeah, or 7, or 6, or 4. And all these numbers, of course, are significant. But so we don't know exactly. But so anyway, kind of jumping back to just kind of get the kind of the high chunky
Yeah.
sort of parts of this chronology. So Abraham, I believe, was born 2128 BC. 500 years later to the year, the Exodus occurs. And this is a little different than what Setterfield comes up with.
Yeah.
I'm jumping to work that's been done by about a half dozen other scholars that believe the volcanic eruption of Santorini on the island of, or I always get the Santorini and Thera mixed up, but I believe it's the island Santorini. Thera is the volcano. It blew in 1628 BC. And we know that date very precisely because of a variety of scientific ways of dating radiocarbon and tree rings, and there's several ways that we know that. But we know that was a colossal event. We know that event could have been involved in the destruction of the Egyptian army. But the main thing we know, which I point out in the book, is that if Israel as a people were still living on the Nile Delta, they likely would have been wiped out by the tidal wave. Tidal wave probably would have been 400 or 500 feet high. It probably would have gone inland for miles and miles and miles. And the reason is that we know the tidal waves were enormous of when Krakatoa blew up, and I believe that was like 1879 or something like that. And that was, of course, Krakatoa was the biggest, the third or something biggest eruption that we know of in the history of the world. Times greater than Krakatoa. And it sent shock waves and tidal waves to the southeast, which was directly at the Nile Delta. And so a number of scholars, some of them Christians, some not, have theorized that the eruption of the volcano it pushed so much water towards Egypt that it might have been part of the means that God used to destroy. He held the water back, and then the water flooded and killed the Egyptians. All right. So it's possible that was when that occurred. And so Setterfield comes up with a 1604 date. There's a couple of ways that you can come up with dates right in between 1604 BC and 1628. A lot of it gets back to exactly how old or how many years was Joshua a judge. And so all these things have to be kind of looked at. So, my bet is being placed that it was 1628, ties directly to the Thera eruption, and that played a part in not so much the plagues, although it's possible, that's what some people theorize, but specifically the destruction of the Egyptian army. Some people don't like that. They want to say, well, you're looking at a natural explanation for a supernatural event. Well, I think it's supernatural enough that God knew, long before the creation of the world, that event was going to happen just at that moment. It was going to be instrumental to destroy the Egyptian army and to allow the Israelites to, in effect, be liberated from their tyranny. So I don't mind saying God uses natural events to do those kinds of things. So there's a 500-year time frame from Abraham's birth to the Exodus. The Exodus occurs. There's 40 years in the wilderness. Then the conquest of Canaan, that's estimated, took 7 years. Might have been as few as 5. Might have been as long as 9. Most believe it took 7 years. And then the period of the judges began. So then the question is, how long was Joshua a judge? He was probably a judge for anywhere from 11 to about 30 years. And then you go look at the whole time of the judges. And long story short, the time of the judges was just a little bit less than 500 years. All right, so you sort of have chunks of like 500 years, about 50 years, and then another 500 years. And then that takes you to the kingdom.
And that's the important thing.
Yeah.
Just this is, that's a good. This is a good point then to ask that question again.
Okay.
It's okay. The chronologies, they're fascinating. It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It's good mind candy to go and dig through these things and try to work it out and see if you can discover and put together some pieces for yourself. But the bottom line is this question: why is this even important, Doug?
Sure. Okay, it's important for this reason. There are 3 theories about when the Exodus took place. Only one of those theories has the support of archaeology. The academic theory, which is supported by a few Christians, is the Exodus took place at 1250 BC. The theory that's most popular with many evangelicals, including a guy named Doug Krieger, is that the Exodus occurred about 1440 BC, 1445 BC, and the conquest of Canaan began around 1405 BC. And I may be misquoting Doug.
No, that's okay. I'm just looking to see if it was in this book that I got right here.
Yeah. So his view is that Joshua, that they cross, they go into Canaan, and then, around 1405, if I'm not mistaken, around 1400 to 1405 BC. All right. Now, that view is also the view of many evangelicals. And that's kind of the view of those people that, are committed to the King James Version and its chronology, which Doug is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Doug admits that I've given him a lot to think about, but that's kind of the commitment. Now, the third view is the view I hold, and it's also the view that Tim Mahoney and David Roll say the evidence points to, but they won't commit to it.
Yeah,
and their evidence, they say, points to about 1650 BC. See, I'm saying 1628 BC. Right? Now, what's important? Okay, the archaeology says that Jericho was destroyed at about 1588 BC. So the 1440 BC and the 1250 BC have no archaeological support. But all the cities in Canaan that are talked about as being destroyed or being burned, like Laish, and there's about 8 or 10 cities that are famous. Those cities, archaeology says they were destroyed around 1550 to 1580 in that time frame BC. So it supports the early Exodus of around 1610 to 1650. I pick a date right in the middle, tie it to the Pharaoh volcano, and say 1628 is probably the best bet for when the Exodus occurs. And then you can make everything kind of lines right up with that.
Yeah, well, you say make, but that's really not the right word. It aligns itself.
That's correct. And so it tends to say if we are willing to agree that the archaeology and the empirical evidence ought to tell us when the Exodus was, and not mistakes that have been made about biblical chronology, because this evangelical bought into a guy named Thiel's understanding and his view of when the kingdom was split and all that, which was based upon Assyrian chronology rather than biblical chronology and so forth. If you go with the 1580-ish time frame, science confirms the Bible. Science contradicts the Bible on the other 2 dates. So that's my point. So I'm very keen on trying to align the Bible's chronology with archaeology and Egyptology, because then it has evidence to support it.
Well, and I think that's the kind of the thing just kind of tying it all together
Yeah.
with the entire thing. This search took you to, okay, so if these datings are wrong, why is it wrong? What's the issues going on? The Septuagint LXX information, the dating that it's providing, David Grohl, Tim Mahoney, these things, you're wrestling with all these, like the rest of us, you're simply after the truth. What is the truth? What can I stand on? Not only just to as trying to witness to somebody who may understand these things, but for my own faith, right?
Right.
For my own faith, what can I hold true and not be, feeling like I'm conflicting or lying anytime I give some information.
Yeah. It's kind of like blind faith versus faith based upon evidence.
Yeah, I got to know for me. And,
me too. That's the way I am.
Well, unfortunately, the generations that followed you and have followed us have been slowly washed into an emotional basis of truth, versus factual basis of truth, and so those kind of arguments don't really, they can't even hear them because they feel.
You're talking about
because you simply made them feel bad, and that's the more important part of the truth.
Yeah, but, the millennials have no interest in history.
No, and
with a few exceptions.
No, yeah, very few. Almost, I would agree, almost none whatsoever. They could care really less. Well, the only thing that matters is today and where we're going and what we
and
can
how
make.
I feel.
Yeah, and how to feel.
And how I feel.
So, we're coming up here on. I think we're about an hour. I got to look at this other screen to see that. Yeah, about 4 minutes away from an hour. And we have just one question here. It's kind of off.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's kind of off topic, but it kind of does dovetail into some of the other books that you've written. So,
all right.
Here's the question: what do you think about the pyramids being spaceships, and what it says in certain scripts about them being spaceships? I have my answer for that, but I want to hear yours.
Yeah. Well, what was the movie about? That Kurt Russell was in, and
that was Ark.
No, it was the kid that was the king, and they supposedly went all across the universe.
They
all had the pyramid spaceships. I can't think of it off. It wasn't Independence Day. It was
no. It was a total Stargate.
Stargate, of course, it was Stargate. Yeah.
Stargate.
Duh. Can't believe I could. Well, see, I don't watch the TV show, so.
Yeah.
So I kind of reject that. But what I don't reject, I don't know the answer to this, of course, is who built the pyramids, and I think that there are two good answers to that. One, and I think this is kind of where Krieger is that he thinks that the sons of Shem built them. I think that's what Josephus said. You might remember that.
Yep.
All right. So they could have built them, in antediluvial times. They could have built them 4,000, 4,500 BC in that time frame. And they could have been done intentionally because, Adam was still alive until about 4,500 BC.
And I'm of that opinion as well, not simply because of Krieger's words, but go ahead.
Yeah. And so it's very conceivable that they built them, as a monument, and that God had given to Adam, and Adam had, as Watchman Nee talks about, had latent powers that we have that are latent, but we don't know how to use them or access them for the most part. But he may have learned all of these things about the world and the sun and the radius of the moon and all of these different things, and it may be a work of himself and his offspring to have created and to know how to build the pyramids. So that's a very conceivable possibility. And I find it fascinating because I happen to believe that, we know that the ages of human beings kind of exponentially drops, over that time until you get down to Abraham. And then, Moses is 120. And how old was Abraham? Was he like 160, 170, something like that? Jacob talks, it's really not, is it Jacob? Yeah. Israel talks about when he's before Pharaoh, the Pharaoh asked him, "How old are you?" And he said, like, "I'm 121 or something like that." He goes, "Yeah, I'm very old, but my age is nothing like the age of my ancestors." And you kind of go, "Aha." How much older was his dad? How much older was Abraham? How much older were they? And he would have known all that, right?
Right.
The ages dropped down exponentially. Perhaps the DNA being more and more corrupted over time.
Yeah.
What about the intelligence?
Oh yeah, I fully believe that. The reason, one of the other, there's one key passage that really sets me to believing that is that when the scripture talks about when I believe that this is the passage that says where the Father says, "And I have set monuments in Egypt," right?
Isaiah 19:19, I think it is.
When he says that, "And I have set," okay, he is taking full responsibility for their creation, which means he gave the information for their construction.
Right.
Directly.
It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. It is the glory of kings to search out a matter.
Right.
And
so he is taking full credit for their construction, at least the beauty. Right. So
that's what I think. I mean, the other option is the Nephilim built it, and it's giving them credit for something that God probably, as you're saying, probably did through the sons of, I don't think through the sons of Shem, because that's really post-flood. I think antediluvial, before the flood, probably even within the time frame of Adam's life. That would be my supposition. Yeah. Now, you can, there's the alternate history that takes them all the way back to 10,000 BC.
Right.
That's the discussion I'll kind of open up in book 2, and it's a great interest to me. I study that a lot. But that's my answer, is that I think there's a good chance that it was built in that time. Again, the Septuagint gives us another 670 years between the flood and Adam that you don't have in the King James Version. And so a lot more could have happened.
Yeah, I want to kind of answer that question myself. The question of what do you think about the pyramids being spaceships? I think it's a Sitchinish kind of a translation, if I can use that word.
Sure.
In meaning, it's a way of translating it and embellishing a translation to make it sound something in modern terms.
Right.
Without really lying, it's just embellishing the way it's translated. When it says, talk about the pyramids being spaceships, in other words, it's a passage to the stars. I think you could understand that in their terms as being, if you can understand these, you can understand the stars and their calculations and all that.
It was
just everything that we've just said. Yeah, it's a metaphor. It's a way to understand the stars, and that's a way to them. And so, you could say, oh, well, it's a spaceship. It's a way to get there, in our modern thinking. But that's not the understanding of how it would have been translated. Yeah. It's a passage to. It's a way of and meaning of understanding them. So that's why I say it's a very Sitchinish type of way of thinking.
That's right.
So
anyway, so that's that's kind of where it leads. So the main point then of chapter 6 and 7 is to show you some of the problems in the Egyptian chronology and problems in the Assyrian chronology, and the reasons why the biblical chronology better fits the empirical evidence of archaeology.
So what I'm going to encourage people to do again, Doug, is tell me where can they buy your book?
Right.
And should they leave a review?
Yeah. Oh gosh, it would help me so much. I mean, the thing I need right now at this stage is I need as many reviews as I can get out on Amazon. I had a troll. I think I told you last night. I had a troll that clearly did not read the book, did not buy the book, just decided they would take a shot at me. So I had Krieger's review and I had this troll's review, but I need people that have actually read the book to give me a review. So Amazon is really where you can find the book, and then there's the Amazon distribution network. But essentially, the printed copies, just a hair more than $20. The Kindle version's out there; it's a penny more than $10. It's $10, and so you can get that. Now I'm writing almost every day on topics related to this on my website, and it's being posted on Facebook as well. So I really encourage you to either, go to my website, which is Doomsday Doug, or faithhappens.com, faith-happens.com, or go to my Facebook page, which is S. Douglas Woodward, and look at the postings, because I'll be doing a lot, I hope, over the weeks and months, Lord willing, to continue to expand upon and offer clarification of what's in the book. Like, for instance, one of the articles that I wrote that I'm getting a lot of reaction to is kind of what difference does it make if if we learned that the world is really 7,500 years, the chronology is really 7,500 years old rather than 6,000 years old.
Right.
And what difference does it make? Well, it makes a lot of difference, but that's kind of what I'm sort of throwing things out like that.
No, yeah, no, I totally get it, Doug. I just want to thank you again for being on the show, more time than
Sure.
any other guest. I really appreciate all that you've added. I know we kind of skipped around in this lot, but there was a lot of really good, important information shared. So maybe go back and listen to it.
Yeah, I will.
When Doug spits out those dates, write them down, stop, and look at some of the information that you have right now, so you can maybe understand what he's saying, because you gave a lot of information in a short time.
Oh yeah. Well, keep in mind that the book is chock full of charts to explain and to show you all these dates with footnotes and so forth. So it's all there. To your point earlier, I try to put everything in one volume. So you've got everything there, so you can look at it, like the preface to the King James Version and how it denies the people that believe the King James Version is the only version. Well, if you read the preface to the King James Version, which I put in an appendix, you realize that they would have totally rejected that. They would have said that's absolutely not what you should do. We made the versions before us better. Someone will come after us and they'll make our version better. And that's the way it should be. That's what they said. Right? So,
all right. Well,
it's all there.
Well, Doug, don't go anywhere. Stick around. I'll talk to you briefly after we're done here. I got a few more final things here to say before we close out. So,
yeah,
a couple of interesting things to share. First thing I want to share is, folks can see now, is my new book cover. You can't see it, Doug, but they can. Mm-hmm. My new book cover, done by Darren Geisinger. This book, I hope to have done at the end of the year. I may even try to get the second edition of my book done in time for the Take on the World conference in August. We'll just have to see how it goes and how well I manage my time. I'm working on a fun project for myself kind of on the side right now, so that's interfering of any real academic work. The second thing I want to share, and this is big news, folks, so if you've stuck around and listened to this for a long time, it's about to happen. So first I want to thank everybody for finding my channel and coming and subscribing since coming off the NICTV platform. However, there's exciting news. Okay, you may be aware, if you know Chris and Liz Bailey, that they've started the Take on the World channel. You are going to find now on that channel, I will be I'm keeping this one, but I will be taking, this will stay Disputed Lands in the Trench. Disputed Lands in this format will now be found on, going on in the future, the Take on the World channel, which many of you guys who subscribe to me have already subscribed to them, along with Biblical Health show that Chris and Liz do, Flat Out Insights that Chris does, with a new show. Also, Tony Stover will be over there. Perhaps even some of your other favorite YouTube hosts that you have been watching may also be found future streaming exclusively on the Take on the World channel. So going on in the future, if you haven't gone to the Take on the World channel, so just like before, instead of just having to subscribe to my show, to somebody else's show, you'll have just one channel where you can find every day or most every day a program coming onto the one channel, the Take on the World channel. So I'd love to really give a big shout out to Chris and Liz for this. I think it's awesome that a bunch of us are going to be coming together to provide one channel, continuation of content found in one location. So, we're all just kind of, since changes occurred, we're all just trying to manage the way through it and figure things out for ourselves too. So I do apologize, but going on in the future, I think being able to find so many shows in one place is going to be a positive benefit for everybody. once again, this has been Disputed Lands, and I appreciate everybody for joining me. And if I get this to work, you're actually going to get to see the outro. And so until I see you the next time, guys, take care.
Get right, get insight, get hungry, word of God appetite. Everlasting water, never again thirsty. To disputed lands, take a journey. Observe, interpret, and apply. Detoxify from demon doctrines, get edified. Fight the good fight, stop getting lied to. The kingdom of heaven is inside you.
Holy Spirit guide you.
Mortify your flesh by the scripture magnified. Applied what's amplified, dead corpse gets electrified. Dry bones get flesh, yelling the battle cry.
To die is gain, to live is right.
Oh yeah, you know that's right. We in this together, grab somebody's hand and hold tight. Study God's word until the world blurs. Fight evil with God's word as the world hurls. Holding steadfast as it all crashes and burns. Cause whom devils disturb are preserved by God's word. That's word. Get right, get insight, get hungry, word of God appetite. Everlasting water, never again thirsty. To disputed lands, take a journey. Get right, get insight, get hungry, word of God appetite. Everlasting water, never again thirsty. To disputed lands, take a journey. Get right, get insight, get hungry, word of God appetite. Everlasting water.